snow had built up to a good 7 to 8 inches and showed no signs of slowing by the time Erin arrived at the Rosewood Retreat retirement home. The journey for her first day there had taken 10 times longer than it usually would, given the severe weather, and since nobody had called her to postpone her opening shift at the home, Erin decided to head in. Even if she was late, it would at least show she was willing. She parked her car in the barely populated lot, the headlights cutting through the swirling flurries as they revealed the large, shadowed building. The nursing home was a little cut off from the town, surrounded by nothing but skeletal trees and winding, snow-covered roads. Her breath fogged up the car window as she peered at her new place of employment. She watched the snow continue to fall heavily and wondered if she'd made the right decision in turning up for work, as the journey home would be treacherous. But I'm here now, she thought. When Erin had been offered a position at Rosewood, she jumped at it. She had experience as a nurse, though this was her first time working in a care home for the elderly. She was more used to being in hospitals, bustling environments filled with doctors and staff, everyone struggling to keep up with tasks due to low staff numbers, so the quiet of the home was in stark contrast to what she was used to. But it was a good opportunity, and Erin had felt a little burned out over the last 12 months. As they always said, change is as good as a rest. Her phone buzzed as she gathered her things. A message from her new supervisor flashed on the screen. "Sorry, Erin, the roads are pretty much closed. We won't make it in today, so if you have made the journey, the night staff will be working extra hours and will accommodate you. Just make yourself comfortable. It's a far from ideal situation, but we need to ensure the safety of the staff." Erin frowned as she wished she'd received the message a little earlier. Her team was going to be like the Walking Dead after working a night shift, but what could she do? Just make the most of it, Erin thought, as she stepped out the car and trudged through the deep snow, her footsteps crunching as she approached the front entrance. Inside the nursing home was silent, save for the low hum of the heating system. The corridor stretched out before her, empty and dimly lit. A strange sensation crept over her as she wandered the hall, glancing at the worn, faded wallpaper and the peeling paint. She could feel a draft despite the heating, and the air smelled faintly of antiseptic and something else, something sour that she couldn't quite place. Her footsteps echoed as she made her way to the residence room, hoping to introduce herself to some of the people staying there. It seemed like the most logical place to start, and given that there were no members of staff around to induct her, Erin thought that would be the best way to begin her day. The first door she reached was slightly ajar, and she peered inside. The man inside was sitting up in bed, his pale face turned towards the window. He was almost unnaturally still, his eyes staring vacantly into the falling snow. Erin cleared her throat a couple times to get the man's attention, but he didn't react. "Hello?" she said softly, stepping closer. "I'm Erin, one of the new nurses here." The man turned slowly, his face expressionless, his eyes dark and glassy. He looked to be in his 70s, his skin stretched over sharp cheekbones, his mouth set in a thin, grim line. Erin thought that the man had a slightly feminine look to him, even though age had a habit of hiding certain things on a person's face that might have been visible years before. It was only the way his thin white hair was cut that made her think it was indeed a man. The two looked at each other, without a word spoken, and there was something about his face that struck Erin as odd. She couldn't quite put her finger on it, but his features seemed almost too symmetrical, too precise, and his eyes, there was a little flatness to them, an emptiness that made her feel a little uncomfortable. "Are you okay, sir? Do you need anything?" she asked, trying to sound upbeat. The man blinked slowly and then turned back towards the window, ignoring her. Erin left the room and pulled the door closed, feeling a strange sense of unease. She then moved up to the next room, where a woman was sat in an identical bed, facing the window in a very similar position. Her hair was long and thin, but she, unlike the man, turned to look at who had entered the room. Chill crawled up Erin's spine as she looked at the woman's face. It was eerily similar to the man she'd just seen. So similar, in fact, that if not for the slight difference in hairstyle, she would have sworn they were the same person. Her gaze drifted over the woman's face, and she felt an inexplicable creeping horror as she realized just how identical they truly were. Erin stood in the hallway, feeling more than a little freaked out at her predicament. She had yet to see a member of staff, and the first two residents she had seen, although different sexes, looked identical. After a minute or so of feeling panicked, Erin managed to calm her breathing and pulled herself together. There were barely any staff due to the weather, and perhaps some of those, who had worked a night shift, had decided they didn't have it in them to continue through into the following day. She decided to continue with her exploration of Rosewood. Erin came across what looked like an expansive lounge, and in the corner sat a man, head slumped as if he had fallen asleep. The man looked to have nodded off while watching TV, and he seemed less rigid than the others. As she drew closer, trying to decide whether or not to wake the man and introduce herself, Erin's breath caught in her throat. A section of the man's beard was hanging slightly loose, peeling away from his face. She reached out instinctively, touching it, and felt the coarse fabric of a fake beard beneath her fingers. She pulled back, horrified, as the entire beard slipped off, revealing somewhat smooth, hairless skin underneath. The man stirred and looked up, his face expressionless, as if unaware or unbothered by the beard's removal. His eyes met hers, and Erin felt a jolt of terror as she realized that he looked exactly like the others. The same angular cheekbones, the same hollow eyes. Her heart thudded in her chest as she backed out of the room, feeling like her brain had been tipped upside down. What the hell is this place? Who are these people? What the fuck is going on here? Erin hurried down the hallway, trying doors as she went, but each one was locked. The windows were sealed tight, and the snow outside was falling thicker, piling against the glass. She felt trapped, caged in this strange, silent place with its unsettling residents. As she turned a corner, Erin noticed the door slightly ajar at the end of the long, dim hallway she hadn't explored yet. A faint light flickered from within, casting strange shadows on the walls. She moved towards it, feeling an inexplicable pull, as if something was drawing her forward. The room beyond the door was small and illuminated only by a small lamp. There were shelves that housed medical equipment, but it was the figure in the center of the room that made Erin's blood run cold. An elderly woman lay on a bed, her body frail and thin, her skin pale as bone. She was naked, her gaunt form stretched across the bed, her face twisted in a grimace of pain, and she looked just like the others. Her face the same hollow mask, her eyes glassy and unfocused, but her belly was swollen, grotesquely large, as if she was in the final stages of pregnancy. Her tongue moving and then lolling to the side. Erin stared in horror as the woman's body convulsed, her mouth opening in a silent scream. The woman's body heaved. Erin watched, frozen as something else began to emerge, a tiny pale hand, followed by a head. A head that, although covered in a thick, sticky fluid, looked just like its mother's. A miniature replica with the same gaunt, hollow face. Erin choked back a gasp, feeling her stomach twist as the creature was born, writhing and squirming, its empty eyes opening to meet hers. The old woman lay still, her body sagging in exhaustion, while the elderly-looking newborn creature squirmed on the bed, its glassy eyes fixed on Erin. She had stumbled back, her mind reeling as she tried to comprehend what she was seeing. It wasn't a birth, it was a duplication, a replication of the same face, the same empty expression. Feeling herself slipping into shock, Erin turned and staggered out of the room, her footsteps echoing through the empty halls as she searched desperately for an exit. Every door was locked, every window sealed. She felt as if the walls were closing in on her, the silent, identical faces of the residents watching her from every corner, their glassy eyes following her movements. Finally, she found herself back at the main entrance, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she tugged at the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. She pounded on the door, screaming for help, but the only answer was the howling wind outside. Erin saw a folded wheelchair leaning against the wall, picked it up, and with all her might, started swinging it against the glass of the main door, but it barely made a dent. She then noticed the door, which was slightly ajar. Erin thought there might be something in there she could use. She ran towards it and pulled it open, but the sight that greeted her was more shocking than the last. Inside was a pile of bodies, stacked like sweaters in a clothing store. The bodies were nothing more than empty bags of skin, with everything within removed. A sound caused her to look back to the room, and there she saw two versions of the same old woman, but each no larger than a 7-year-old. There was a body in front of them that seemed to have more substance than the others, more fullness, and the two small naked beings had their mouths latched onto it. Both seemed to be feeding on the body as it continued to slowly deflate. But things only got worse when she saw the eyes of the nurse looking straight at her. and then saw the mouth move. Whoever it was those creatures were devouring, the person was still alive. Erin ran back into the hallway, her determination to escape reaching a whole new level. She took out her phone, tried to call the police, but was only greeted with a high-pitched noise that sent a searing pain through her head and caused her to drop the phone to the floor. A faint rustling echoed the hallway. She turned, her heart hammering as she saw the residents emerging from their rooms, one by one, their identical pale faces remaining expressionless. They moved towards her, their hollow eyes fixed with an unsettling intensity. Erin backed against the door, wanting to move, but finding it almost impossible. They moved closer, all exactly the same, duplicates of each other, replicas born from that frail, hollow creature she had seen in that badly lit room. The place was not a retirement home. It was a factory, a breeding ground for these strange, identical beings. Cycle of replication. Her mind reeled as the residents closed in around her, their faces a sea of emptiness, their eyes cold and unfeeling. She had to get out, but their mouths looked hungry. In a final desperate act, Erin threw herself against the door, pounding with all her strength, screaming as loud as she could. But the door remained closed, the walls thick and unyielding, trapping her within the twisted confines of the home. And as the residents reached her, their cold hands closing around her, she realized with sickening certainty that she, too, would become a part of their cycle. She felt their mouths attached to her. There were no teeth, no bites, just the feeling of them trying to absorb her. With each passing second, Erin began to feel lesser, lighter, and a little more hollow. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in cold, unbroken stillness. A beautiful scene, total contrast to the horrors within Rosewood Retreat. Inside, the cycle continued, and an increasingly hollow Erin stared outside, watching the snowflakes fall, each one looking identical to the other. Adam, a week shy of his 21st birthday, felt a cold wind cut through his jacket as he stood before the weather-beaten wooden cabin nestled deep in the forest. As he looked at his grandma's home, Adam wished he could say it hadn't changed a bit, but the truth was, he had no recollection of the cabin or the woman who dwelt there, only a vague image of what she had looked like when he was a child. He glanced around, noting how the place seemed forgotten, swallowed by creeping ivy and shadows cast by the twisting branches of the ancient towering trees surrounding it. As he walked up the crooked path, the air grew colder, the silence more pronounced. Only the occasional rustle of leaves disturbed the otherwise absolute quiet, adding to the feeling of isolation. Adam hesitated on the front steps, wondering why he felt so tense. He wished he could remember his grandmother as kind and playful, but he could recall nothing. On top of that, his instincts told him something wasn't quite right. He raised his hand to knock, but before his knuckles met the wood, the door swung open, revealing the cabin's sole inhabitant. She was small, her frame thin and fragile, which was visible even under layers of mismatched sweaters. Her white hair was wispy and unkempt, falling around her face like cobwebs. "Adam?" she murmured, her voice barely a whisper. Her eyes seemed alert, almost wary. "Hi, Gran," Adam said, managing a smile as he tried to shake off the unease creeping over him. Maybe she's just tired or a little out of it, he thought. She gave him a long, searching look, then stepped back, allowing him to enter. The air inside was thick and musty, carrying a faint scent of herbs and dust. Adam noticed right away that the grandmother seemed to avoid getting too close, keeping a small distance as she led him to his room. Their conversation was minimal, filled with pleasantries and nothing of substance. Every few seconds, her eyes flicked toward him, her fingers nervously twisting the fabric of her sweater. "It's good to see you," she said softly, her voice trembling just a little. "I wasn't sure you'd come." Adam furrowed his brow, uncertain about the meaning of her words. "But I'm glad you're here," she continued. "It's been a while since I had any visitors." "I don't have anywhere else to go, Grandma." "Well, that doesn't matter. You're here now," she replied. As the evening wore on, Adam's grandmother's behavior grew more odd. She barely ate at dinner, sitting silently across from him, watching him with that same intense look. It caused anxiety to bubble up in Adam's gut. They ate in near silence, and the flickering candlelight cast eerie shadows across her face, exaggerating the hollows under her eyes, making her appear gaunt and haunted. Finally, Adam felt the need to say something. "Are you alright, Gran?" Her gaze snapped up, and she gave a thin, wavering smile. "Of course, dear. I'm just tired. I've been cleaning all day. And, as I said, I don't get many visitors, so forgive me if I'm a little rusty at playing hostess." After dinner, she quickly cleared the table, muttering something under her breath before scuttling off into the kitchen. Adam was left alone in the dim dining room, an uncomfortable silence pressing down on him. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was something she wasn't telling him, an unspoken tension in every glance and hurried movement. That night, he lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling, unable to sleep. The house creaked and groaned as the wind howled outside. Branches tapping against the window. A strange feeling settled over him, as if he were being watched. He told himself it was just the unfamiliar setting, the isolation, but he couldn't shake it. Just as he was drifting off, he heard the creak of the floorboards outside his room. His heart skipped, and he held his breath, listening. Another creak, closer this time, then again. He waited, his pulse quickening, as the footsteps paused just outside his room. Slowly, and with sweat pouring from his skin, Adam sat up, his gaze fixed on the door. The hallway was dark, but he could make out a shadow hovering just beyond the threshold. "Gran?" he called softly. The shadows shifted, retreating a few steps. Then there was silence. The next morning, Adam tried to brush off the incident as a trick of the night. But at breakfast, he noticed his grandmother's eyes were bloodshot, her face pale and drawn. She looked as though she hadn't slept, her fingers trembling slightly as she poured tea. "Were you up during the night?" he asked, watching her reaction. She flinched, her hand freezing mid-pour. For a brief moment, he saw her eyes flick left and right before she looked away, pressing her lips into a thin line. "I couldn't sleep," she muttered, her voice barely audible. "As you get older, sleep comes less easily." The day passed in a blur of strange silences and stolen glances, and Adam tried to convince himself that she was just an old woman, perhaps unused to having someone in the house. But as night fell, the anxious feeling in his gut only grew stronger. That night, the creaking footsteps returned. This time he waited, listening as they moved closer to his door, pausing just outside. Slowly, he slipped out of bed, heart thudding as he approached the door, pressing his ear against the cold wood. He heard her breathing, shallow, quick, nervous or excited. Something stirred inside him, a strange unease mixed with something else he couldn't quite grasp. He carefully opened the door just a crack and peered into the dark hallway. His grandmother stood at the far end, half hidden in the shadows, wearing a nightgown. She was still, watching him. Adam stood frozen for a few moments, then felt a surge of courage, thinking to confront her, but as he stared into the darkness, his nerve faded. Instead, he closed the door quietly and slipped back into bed, pulling the covers up tight. He didn't sleep that night, lying awake under the weight of her lingering gaze. As the nights passed, her behavior grew stranger. He caught her watching him from around corners, peering at him through door cracks. Her expression was always tense. On the fifth night, Adam couldn't take it anymore. He needed answers. That evening, he waited until the house was silent, then moved toward the door, heart pounding. He didn't know what he intended to do, only that he had to confront her, to understand why she was acting this way. Opening his door a crack, he watched as she moved down the hall, glancing over her shoulder, her eyes wide, almost bulging. He considered calling out to her, but a dark feeling twisted in his chest, holding him back. Instead, he reached into the pocket of his jacket, feeling the cold metal of the knife. He didn't remember packing it, but it felt reassuring in his hand, filling him with a strange sense of comfort. He stepped into the hallway and began to follow her. Slowly, as she scurried into the kitchen, she hadn't noticed him. her focus on the back door as her hands trembled, fumbling with the lock. "Gran?" Adam said softly. She froze, her head snapping around. Fear filled her eyes, primal and raw. "Adam, please," she whispered. "Don't." He took a step forward, unable to stop himself, tightening his grip on the knife. A dark satisfaction filled him as he watched her back away. She no longer looked eerie, just old and terrified. Then she stumbled, falling to the floor, her hands raised in a feeble attempt to ward him off. "Why are you afraid of me, Gran?" he murmured, barely more than a whisper. "You're the only one who's been acting creepy as hell since I got here." Tears filled her eyes, her lips quivering as she looked up at him. "Because I know who you are, Adam. I know what you're capable of. You took my son from me. Your own father." He froze, his mouth slightly ajar as the memory flashed through his mind. A darkened room, his parents' terrified faces, his own hands covered in their blood. The images came thick and fast, the knife plunging into them, fingers sliced off in the frenzied assault. He watched the life fade from their eyes, felt their souls depart as their hearts stopped. A strange calm settled over him as he looked down at his grandmother, trembling on the floor. He felt a flicker of guilt, a moment of hesitation, but it was drowned out by a dark, familiar urge. He smiled as adrenaline flooded his senses, a pleasurable feeling overtaking him. His grandmother, with a drained face, scuttled backward. Adam took his time stalking her, enjoying the chase almost as much as the kill. Her lips moved quickly, muttering words. When he finally reached her, he heard her faintly, the poor defenseless woman about to meet her end. Adam crouched, noticing her legs and feet were covered in a strange white dust. "Lord's Prayer won't help you now," he grinned, but as he did, her words grew louder until he understood them. "Prodi et kep ium," she chanted, over and over. "What are you saying?" he sneered. But strangely, even though he knew no Latin, the words began making sense. "Come forth and take him." His grandmother's laugh grew, filling the room as a pain seared through Adam's head, and that pain grew into an unbearable level in just seconds. He began to scream, feeling like his head was going to explode. Adam raised the knife to his own throat, just wanting the pain to end, but something stopped him. He was no longer in control. Something else was now in his mind, in his body. He staggered back, screaming in pain, feeling as if his soul was being pulled out of him. In that brief moment, he caught a glimpse of his father, his spirit rising within Adam's body, as his own began to slip away. His grandmother, now calm, spoke. "That's right, Adam. You took my son from me, but I've spent years mastering the dark magic needed to bring him back. Through you, he will continue to live, as your soul is pushed into Regio Purgatori." With that, Adam felt his mind and soul leave his form, before descending into the abyss.